The bell over the door chimed softly as Sam slipped into the tiny shoe shop, his shoulders hunched, his gaze darting around the room. He didn't look like the usual customer. He wore a faded blue sweatshirt, frayed at the edges, and his sneakers were so worn down that his socks peeked through. But it was his eyes, tired, restless, determined, that might have given him away had anyone looked closely enough. No one paid him much attention. The store was quiet, with just a few shelves lined with neatly arranged shoes and the faint smell of polish lingering in the air. Sam moved with purpose, scanning the rows until he found the pair he'd been eyeing for weeks. They were simple shoes, nothing fancy, but they looked solid and new. For his younger brother, they would be everything. Sam's hands shook as he reached out, slipping the sneakers off the shelf and into his backpack. His heartbeat drummed loudly in his ears, drowning out all other sounds. He turned, clutching the bag tightly, and made his way toward the exit, his steps hurried yet cautious. Just as he reached for the door, a voice rang out, calm but firm. "Where are you going with those shoes, son?" Sam froze, his hand hovering in midair. Slowly, he turned around to face the speaker, a tall, wiry man with salt and pepper hair and a face lined with years of hard work. Mr. Higgins, the store's owner, looked at him with steady, unblinking eyes, a quiet strength radiating from his presence. There was no anger in his gaze, only a strange curiosity that made Sam's stomach twist in knots. Sam swallowed hard, clinging to the hope that he could somehow talk his way out of this. He mumbled, I was just my brother. We just need these shoes, sir." His words tumbled out, jumbled, half-hearted, as he stared down at the scuffed floor. Mr. Higgins didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at Sam for a long, silent moment, and then gestured for him to follow. "Come with me to the back room. We need to talk." Sam's heart sank, but he followed, feeling like he was walking to his own sentencing. The back room was small, cluttered with stacks of old shoeboxes, a desk covered in paperwork, and a well-worn armchair. Mr. Higgins took a seat, motioning for Sam to sit across from him. Sam hesitated but sat down, fidgeting with his hands as he avoided the man's gaze. "Now," Mr. Higgins said in a low, calm voice, "you're going to tell me why a young man like you feels the need to steal." Sam's mouth went dry as he sat across from Mr. Higgins, the man's calm gaze piercing through the silence. For a moment he thought about running, darting out the back door and not looking back. But something in Mr. Higgins's face kept him there, something that seemed almost kind. Hesitating, Sam began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. It's my little brother, sir. His name's Jake. He's only 10, and his shoes, they're so bad now that he keeps tripping at school. The other kids laugh at him." Sam's eyes flickered down to his own worn sneakers. "I couldn't let him keep going like that. But we don't have enough." Mr. Higgins listened without interrupting, his hands resting calmly on the armrests of his chair. "Why don't you tell me more about your family, Sam?" Sam swallowed hard. He'd rarely spoken to anyone outside his family about their situation. Most people avoided the topic, or worse, pitied them. But Mr. Higgins's gaze was steady, so Sam continued. "My dad used to work at the factory on Thompson Street, but it closed down 2 years ago. Since then, he's been trying to find something steady, but it's been tough. My mom, well, she's been sick, and now she can't work at all." Sam's voice cracked, and he quickly wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. "So it's just me trying to help out, doing odd jobs when I can, but it's not enough. And Jake," he paused, his voice trembling, "Jake shouldn't have to suffer because of it." Mr. Higgins nodded thoughtfully. He leaned back in his chair, considering what Sam had shared. "Tell you what, Sam," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm not going to call the police, but I do want to make you an offer." Sam's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and confusion flashing across his face. Mr. Higgins continued, "How about you come here after school each day? I could use an extra pair of hands around the store, and in return I'll let you keep those shoes as a down payment." Sam's breath caught. Work at the store? He could hardly believe it. He didn't want charity. He'd made that clear to anyone who'd ever offered. But a job, this was different. Are you sure, sir?" Sam stammered, hardly able to look Mr. Higgins in the eye. The older man smiled, his face softening. Of course, I'm sure. It's clear you're someone who cares deeply about his family. That's something I respect. But you need to work honestly for what you need. Understand? Sam nodded vigorously, his mind racing with thoughts of how he could finally bring something home to his family, something they desperately needed. His chest felt lighter, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself a sliver of hope. In the days that followed, Sam's life took on a new rhythm. Each afternoon after school, he made his way to Mr. Higgins's shop. He learned how to stack boxes, clean displays, and even helped polish the shoes to a gleaming shine. Though it was tiring, he found himself looking forward to it. Each evening, as he pocketed his modest pay, he felt a surge of pride. But as the weeks passed, Mr. Higgins began to notice things about Sam. The boy was bright, picking up on things quickly, but there was a hardness to him, a kind of resilience that hinted at a life much more difficult than he had let on. One rainy evening, as Sam was finishing up for the day, Mr. Higgins saw him stuffing his hands into his pockets, shivering from the cold. He glanced at the boy's thin, threadbare jacket, and a pang of concern crossed his face. "Sam, do you have a decent coat for the winter?" he asked, keeping his tone light. Sam's face flushed and he looked away. "This one's fine," he mumbled, though the worn fabric told a different story. Mr. Higgins nodded, making a mental note but saying nothing more. That night, after Sam left, Mr. Higgins went into the back room, rummaging through an old trunk. He pulled out a sturdy winter coat, one he had once worn years ago, but that was still in good shape. It was a little large, but he figured it would fit Sam well enough. Folding it neatly, he set it on the counter for the boy to find the next day. When Sam arrived at the shop the following afternoon, he was greeted by the sight of the coat, laid out with a small note in Mr. Higgins's neat handwriting. "For you. Stay warm, kid. No one should go without." Sam stared at the coat, his throat tightening. His first instinct was to refuse, to leave it right there. But he knew he didn't have another option. It was already getting colder, and he'd soon need something warm if he wanted to keep working. Reluctantly, he picked up the coat and slipped it on. It was large but warm, the fabric rough but comforting, like an unexpected embrace. When Mr. Higgins walked in, Sam mumbled, "Thank you, sir." Mr. Higgins only nodded, his face expressionless, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But Sam could feel the warmth of the gesture as he left that night, holding his head a little higher. One Friday, just as Sam was leaving, he noticed an envelope on the counter with his name on it. Curious, he opened it and found a small stack of bills, far more than what he was used to earning. He turned to Mr. Higgins, bewildered. "Sir, I think there's been a mistake. This is too much." Mr. Higgins shook his head, a rare smile breaking across his face. "No mistake, Sam. I had a friend stop by earlier looking for someone to help out with an upcoming sale. I told him you were the perfect man for the job. Consider it a bonus for being such a hard worker." Sam's face lit up, and for a moment, he could barely speak. He knew what this money would mean. His family could eat better this week, and Jake could even get a new set of clothes for school. He managed a choked, "Thank you," his eyes shining. But as he walked home that night, a gnawing doubt crept in. Why had Mr. Higgins been so kind to him? He'd heard stories, after all. People didn't help others without wanting something in return. Was there something he wasn't seeing? The following day, Sam noticed a strange tension in the shop. Mr. Higgins seemed distracted, checking his phone more often than usual. Finally, he sighed, pocketing his phone and looking over at Sam. "I've been keeping something from you, Sam," he said, his voice low and serious. Sam felt his heart skip a beat. Was he about to lose the one place that had brought his family a small glimmer of hope? "Something about my past," Mr. Higgins continued, his eyes darkening as he looked away. Sam stood in the dimly lit shop, his eyes wide as he watched Mr. Higgins, who seemed almost hesitant for the first time. The older man, usually so calm and composed, now fidgeted, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond Sam's shoulder. "Mr. Higgins?" Sam asked cautiously, his voice barely above a whisper. A knot of anxiety twisted in his stomach. "What's going on?" Mr. Higgins took a deep breath, steeling himself. "I haven't always been, well, a shop owner, Sam." He glanced at the boy, a look of regret crossing his face. "Years ago, I made choices I'm not proud of. My family lost everything because of me. I thought I could fix it, but he trailed off, his words thick with old, buried pain. Sam listened, a mixture of confusion and sympathy clouding his expression. "What do you mean?" he asked, daring to press. He'd never seen Mr. Higgins this way, and he felt strangely compelled to understand. "Let's just say that I was too focused on money and status, and I lost sight of what mattered," Mr. Higgins explained, his voice a low murmur. "My wife, she left me. I wasn't the man she thought she'd married, and it was my fault." His shoulders sagged, weighed down by the memory. "My son, I haven't seen him since he was about your age." Sam's heart clenched at the sight of the man's pain. He hadn't expected this. For weeks, he had believed Mr. Higgins was just a kind old man who had taken a chance on him out of pity or charity. Now, he was beginning to see that there was so much more to the story. Mr. Higgins straightened up as if shaking off the shadows of his past. "That's why I try to help kids like you. You remind me of him, of my son, I mean. I couldn't be there for him, but maybe I can be there for someone else." Sam didn't know what to say. There were no easy words for a story like this. All he could do was nod, a heavy understanding passing between them. Just then, the bell over the shop door rang, breaking the heavy silence. Both turned to see a tall, stern-looking man with sharp features and a dark suit step into the store. His gaze settled on Mr. Higgins, and a slight smirk twisted his lips. "Long time no see, Higgins," the man sneered, his voice thick with disdain. "I thought you'd be long gone by now, hiding out here playing the humble shopkeeper." Mr. Higgins's face paled, and Sam sensed a sudden tension, an unspoken history between the two men. Mr. Higgins took a slow step forward, standing his ground. "What do you want, Barker?" Barker scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "You owe me, old man. Or have you forgotten that little incident from years back? Some people never forget debts, Higgins, and neither do I." Sam's heart pounded as he looked between the two men, a dark realization dawning on him. Was Mr. Higgins in trouble? And how far would this man go to settle whatever grudge he held? "Look, I'm not the man I was then," Mr. Higgins said, his voice wavering slightly. "Whatever it is you think I owe, I've paid my price. Leave these kids out of it." Barker's eyes flicked to Sam, a cold, calculating gleam flashing in them. "This kid means something to you?" he said, a smirk spreading across his face. "Interesting." He paused, then continued with a menacing tone. "I think maybe it's time the boy learns just who he's dealing with." Sam felt a shiver run down his spine. He glanced at Mr. Higgins, a silent question in his eyes. But before he could ask, Barker turned on his heel and stormed out, leaving a dark silence hanging in his wake. "Mr." Higgins closed his eyes, rubbing his temples as though trying to ward off a painful memory. "Sam, I'm sorry you had to see that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted this life to touch you." But Sam was undeterred. "What did he mean?" he pressed, feeling a strange surge of determination. "You don't have to hide it from me, Mr. Higgins. Whatever you did back then, I know you're not that person anymore." Mr. Higgins looked at Sam, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the shop door swung open again, this time with a forceful bang. Two men dressed in rough work clothes strode inside, their expressions hard and unfriendly. "Your friend Barker sent us," one of them said, his tone cold and unyielding. "He said it's time to collect." Mr. Higgins moved in front of Sam, shielding him instinctively. "This isn't the way," he said firmly, his voice regaining some of its former strength. "You don't need to involve him." The men exchanged a glance, their expressions unchanging. "That's not our call to make," the second man replied. "All we know is that you owe our boss and he's getting tired of waiting." Fear flashed across Sam's face, but he took a deep breath, steadying himself. He stepped out from behind Mr. Higgins, standing beside him. "I don't care what this Barker guy thinks you owe him," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "Mr. Higgins has done nothing but help me. Whatever this is, he doesn't deserve this." The two men exchanged glances, seemingly unfazed by Sam's outburst. "Loyal kid," one of them muttered, shaking his head. "Too bad loyalty won't pay the debt." Just as things seemed to be spiraling out of control, the shop's phone rang, piercing the silence. Mr. Higgins gestured to Sam, and after a moment's hesitation, Sam picked up the receiver. "Hello?" he said, his voice tense. A familiar voice spoke on the other end, Mr. Higgins's estranged son. "Sam? It's Tommy Higgins? I don't know if my father's there, but I heard he might be in trouble. I want to help." Sam's eyes widened as he glanced at Mr. Higgins, who was still trying to keep the two men at bay. "Tommy?" he whispered, hardly believing what he was hearing. "Your father, he needs you. He's trying to make things right." On the other end, there was a pause, then a sigh. Tell him I'm on my way. And Sam, tell him I remember the good times too." Hanging up, Sam looked over at Mr. Higgins, who seemed weary, his shoulders heavy under the weight of the years. "Sir," Sam said, his voice strong, "your son is coming. He knows you're in trouble and he wants to help." Mr. Higgins's eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and relief. He turned back to the men, his voice firm. "Tell Barker I'm not paying a single cent more. My son and I will settle this ourselves." The men hesitated, perhaps sensing the shifting power in the room, then finally backed down. "Fine, but we'll be back," one of them muttered as they left. The shop was silent again. Mr. Higgins turned to Sam, his face etched with gratitude and pain. "You've given me a second chance, Sam," he said softly. "One I don't deserve. And now, maybe my son and I can finally make things right." But the ordeal wasn't over yet. Outside, the headlights of a car flashed through the shop window as Barker's men pulled away. Sam's heart pounded, knowing this wouldn't be the last they'd hear from him. Yet for the first time, Mr. Higgins looked at peace. And as he and Sam waited for Tommy to arrive, Sam felt something powerful, a hope that things could be different, that even in a world full of wrongs, there was still room to make things right. As they waited in the quiet of the shop, Mr. Higgins sat down heavily in the worn armchair behind the counter, his eyes distant yet calmer than they'd been in years. Sam paced nearby, glancing toward the door every few seconds, his mind racing. He knew that Barker wouldn't give up easily, but he also knew that Mr. Higgins wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. Just then, the sound of a car engine pulled their attention to the shop entrance. A young man, perhaps in his late 20s, with the same salt and pepper hair as Mr. Higgins, stepped out of the vehicle. He moved with a guarded, almost hesitant air as he approached the door, his gaze flickering between Sam and his father as he entered. Mr. Higgins's breath caught as he saw his son, Tommy, for the first time in over a decade. The years apart were evident in the lines on Mr. Higgins's face, but his eyes softened as he took in his son's presence. The tension that had haunted him all evening seemed to melt away, replaced by a mixture of relief and a touch of uncertainty. "Tommy," Mr. Higgins said, his voice breaking slightly. He stepped forward, but he held back, not wanting to push. Tommy nodded, his expression unreadable at first, but then something shifted. He gave his father a small, hesitant smile, as if remembering a distant memory of who his father used to be. "It's been a long time," he replied, his voice soft but steady. They stood in silence for a few moments, words failing them both. Finally, it was Sam who broke the stillness, stepping forward with a mixture of eagerness and hope. "Mr. Higgins has done so much to make things right," he said, looking at Tommy. "He's been a real friend to me and my family. He's not the man he used to be. He's better now." Tommy's eyes shifted to Sam, a spark of warmth in his gaze. "Thank you for looking out for him," he said, nodding slowly. I wasn't sure if he'd changed, but it sounds like he has." The faintest hint of a smile crossed Mr. Higgins's face. "I've tried, son. I really have." Just then, the door rattled as Barker pushed his way back into the shop, a smug expression plastered across his face. He looked from Tommy to Mr. Higgins, his smirk widening. "Well, well, family reunion, huh? Isn't this touching?" Tommy turned to face Barker, his jaw set, his eyes narrowing. "I don't know what you think my father owes you, but whatever it is, we'll settle it right here, right now." Barker scoffed, his gaze dripping with contempt. "Oh, you think you're going to waltz in here and just clear it all up, do you? Your old man owes me a lot more than a handshake and an apology. I was kind enough to wait this long, but now it's time to pay up." Tommy's eyes flashed with determination. "I've got something better than money, Barker. I have friends in places that could make your life complicated." His words hung heavy in the air, and a subtle tension crackled between them. "Leave us alone, or I'll make sure your little business ventures get the attention they deserve." Barker's face paled, a flicker of unease flashing in his eyes. He took a step back, glancing between the three of them, the balance of power visibly shifting. "Fine," he muttered through clenched teeth, "but don't think this is over. I'll be watching." With a last cold glare, he stormed out of the shop, slamming the door behind him. A sigh of relief escaped all three as Barker's car sped off down the street. Mr. Higgins's shoulders relaxed, and he finally allowed himself a real smile, one that reached his eyes. He looked at Tommy, gratitude filling his gaze. "Thank you, son. I didn't expect... after everything..." Tommy shrugged, looking away as if embarrassed. "It's not for the past, Dad. It's for who you are now. And for Sam." He gave the young boy a nod. "I see how much you've helped him. That means something." Over the next few hours, Tommy and Mr. Higgins talked, delving into memories they hadn't dared to speak of in years. Sam watched the two reconnect, feeling a profound sense of joy as father and son bridged the gap between them. Mr. Higgins apologized, stumbling over his words, and Tommy listened, his expression softening as his father spoke of regrets and hopes for the future. As dawn approached, Tommy stood to leave, but not before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small stack of business cards. "Here, Dad," he said, handing them over. "If Barker or anyone else ever comes looking for trouble again, just give me a call. You're not alone in this anymore." Mr. Higgins nodded, accepting the cards with a look of gratitude. He reached out, and Tommy took his hand, giving it a firm shake before surprising everyone, including himself, by pulling his father into a brief but heartfelt hug. It was an unspoken promise, a quiet beginning to a new chapter between them. As Tommy left, Sam felt a sense of pride and fulfillment settle over him. He had never imagined that his desperate attempt to help his brother would lead to such a journey, not only for himself, but for Mr. Higgins as well. The man had become a father figure to him, a friend, and a source of strength he hadn't known he needed. In the weeks that followed, life at the shop returned to a comforting routine. Sam continued working for Mr. Higgins, who was no longer haunted by the ghosts of his past. Together they laughed and shared stories, each finding solace in the other's company. And though Barker and his threats remained an unspoken shadow in the background, Sam knew that they had faced something together that made them stronger. One afternoon, just before closing, Mr. Higgins handed Sam a small envelope with a faint smile. Inside was a generous paycheck, enough for Sam's family to get through the next few months with a little extra to spare. "Consider it a bonus," Mr. Higgins said, his eyes twinkling with mischief, "for helping an old man find his way back to his family." Sam laughed, his voice bright and free. "Thank you, sir. I don't know how to say how much this means." "No need, Sam," Mr. Higgins replied, his gaze warm. "Just keep being who you are. That's all the thanks I'll ever need." As Sam left the shop that evening, he looked back one last time, watching as Mr. Higgins waved from the doorway, his face peaceful and content. He realized he wasn't just leaving a job, he was leaving a place where he had found a kind of family, a place where second chances weren't just words but actions. When Sam reached home, he handed his mother the envelope, and her eyes filled with tears. "You did this?" she whispered, her voice breaking with pride. Sam nodded, feeling a surge of pride of his own. For the first time, Sam believed that things could truly change, that hope wasn't just something for other people, but something he could hold onto himself. And as he drifted off to sleep that night, he knew that whatever lay ahead, he would face it with the same courage that had brought him this far. If you enjoyed this story of second chances and family, remember to subscribe to HeroKind Stories. Don't miss our next video. There's another inspiring tale waiting for you right now. Just click on the screen and be ready for a story that will warm your heart. Thank you for watching and see you in the next story.